In the summer of 1994, on a 220-acre tobacco farm 12 miles south of Danville, Kentucky, a 41-year-old woman named Lenora Fisk walked out to the back 40 acres. Her late husband had always called the rough ground and stood there for a long time looking at the red clay soil that had not grown a decent crop of anything in 11 years. She was holding a folded piece of paper in her left hand. She had been carrying it since March. It was a printout from a university extension bulletin she had ordered by mail from the University of Kentucky College of Agriculture. And the paper described something called silvopasture, which was the practice of integrating trees with forage crops and livestock on the same ground. She had read it so many times, the fold lines were white. She had not shown it to anyone. Her daughter, Tess, was 22 that summer and had come home from Lexington after 2 years of college to help run the farm after Lenora's husband, Darrell Fisk, died of a heart attack in the cab of his tractor in October of 1993. Tess had wanted to go back to school. Lenora had not asked her to stay. Tess had stayed anyway, which was the kind of thing Tess did, and which Lenora understood was a gift she had not earned and could not repay, and could only accept with the fullness it deserved. The back 40 had been tobacco ground in the 1970s. It had been pasture for a beef cow herd in the 1980s. Darrell had let the herd go in 1987 when the cattle prices dropped and the veterinary bills climbed. And after the cattle were sold, the back 40 became the kind of ground that farms accumulate over time. Ground that is too steep for row crops and too thin-soiled for reliable hay, and too far from the road to be worth fencing back in. It had grown up in broom sedge and blackberry cane and scrub cedar. The neighbors called it waste ground. Darrell had called it the rough ground, which was a kinder name for the same thing. Lenora did not think it was waste ground. She had been thinking about that 40 acres for 6 years, since 1988, when she had driven past a farm outside of Berea, where someone had planted black walnut trees in rows through old pasture and was running a small flock of sheep between the rows. And the sheep were fat, and the trees were 30 feet tall, and the whole 40 looked more alive than anything she had passed for an hour in either direction. She had stopped the truck. She had sat on the shoulder of the road for 10 minutes looking at it. She had not known the name for what she was seeing. She had found the name 6 years later in the extension bulletin she was holding in her left hand. On the August morning, she walked out to the rough ground, do with it, and decided what she was going to do with it. She was going to plant trees. Specifically, she was going to plant a mixed planting of black walnut and white oak on 15-acre blocks, spaced wide enough to allow mowing equipment between the rows, with a permanent fescue clover mix under-sown in the alleys, and a small rotational sheep flock managed between the tree rows from year 3 onward. The black walnuts would not produce harvestable timber for 30 years. The white oaks would not produce harvestable mast for 20. The sheep would produce income in year 2. The system, according to the extension bulletin, and to a second bulletin she had written away. For from the University of Missouri, and to a long letter she had received in June from a researcher at the Savannah Institute in Madison, who had answered her handwritten inquiry with 4 pages of typed notes, would produce more combined income per acre by year 15 than the back 40 had produced at any point in the previous 20 years of tobacco and cattle and neglect. She had a folder in her kitchen drawer that was 2 inches thick. She had not shown it to anyone. What Lenora Fisk knew that very few people in Boyle County, Kentucky knew in 1994 was that tree roots and grass roots occupy entirely different soil horizons. Grass roots run in the top 18 inches. Walnut roots descend past 6 feet. By year 10, the trees she was planning to plant would not compete with the forage for moisture or nutrients in any meaningful way during the forage's productive years. She knew that the shade cast by widely spaced trees in a silvopasture system reduced heat stress on grazing animals in summer and reduced evapotranspiration in the soil, which meant the forage stayed green 2 to 3 weeks longer in a dry August than it did in an open pasture. She knew this because she had spent the previous 3 summers driving to farms in Virginia and Tennessee, and 1 farm in Ontario, Canada, that was running the system on 200 acres, and she had stood in the tree alleys in the heat of July and felt the temperature difference with her own body. She had not told Darrell about those drives. He had been sick by then, and she had told him she was going to visit her sister in Knoxville, which was partly true, because she had visited her sister in Knoxville and then driven 4 hours further east to look at a silvopasture operation outside of Abingdon, Virginia, and walked the rows in the morning light and asked the farmer 11 questions, and written the answers in a small brown notebook she kept in the glove box of her truck. She had 3 brown notebooks by August of 1994. Tess found out about the plan on the Tuesday morning Lenora called the State Forestry office to ask about the tree seedling program. Tess came into the kitchen for coffee and found her mother on the phone asking about minimum order quantities for bare root walnut and oak seedlings and spacing recommendations for silvopasture establishment. Tess sat down at the kitchen table and drank her coffee and waited until the call was done. Then she said, "What's silvopasture?" Lenora explained for 45 minutes. She put the 2-inch folder on the table. Tess read through the first extension bulletin and the Missouri bulletin and the 4 pages from the researcher in Madison. She read for 20 minutes without saying anything. Then she said, "The back 40. Yes. When do the trees go in?" "March. Bare root stock goes in before bud break." Tess looked out the window at the back 40, which was not visible from the kitchen, but which both of them knew was back there behind the ridge. "How many trees?" 480. Tess nodded. She picked up her coffee cup. "Okay," she said. That was the conversation. There was no argument, no hesitation, no 3 days of Tess going quiet and coming back with reservations. Tess had grown up on a farm, and she understood that a farm that was not changing was a farm that was dying. And she trusted her mother with the same uncomplicated confidence a person trusts a river to run downhill. What Lenora did not know that morning was that this would be the last uncomplicated part of the next 8 years. The complications began with her neighbor, Owen Pruitt, who farmed 400 acres of corn and soybeans directly to the north, and who had been Darrell's closest friend for 22 years, and who had, at Darrell's graveside service the previous October, put his hand on Lenora's arm and told her that if running the operation alone ever became too much, she should call him, and that he would always be willing to talk through a fair price for the Fisk ground. He had said it with genuine warmth. He had meant it with genuine interest in the ground. Owen Pruitt heard about the silvopasture plan from the feed store in Danville, where the owner, a man named Clement Bassey, who had sold feed to Darrell Fisk for 15 years, and who heard everything that passed through the county, mentioned to Owen, in passing, that Lenora Fisk had ordered 2 tons of orchard grass clover seed mix and a specialized tree planting bar that nobody in Boyle County had ordered before. Owen drove over on a Friday afternoon in September of 1994. He sat at the kitchen table in the same chair where Tess had sat. He had not been in the kitchen since the week after Daryl's funeral, when he and his wife had brought a casserole and sat for an hour and said all the things people say. He looked older than she remembered from that day, or she was looking at him differently. Lenora, Owen said, "I heard you're putting trees on the back 40. I am." He put his hands flat on the table. He was a large man with large hands, and the habit when he was working out a position of looking at those hands as if they held the answer. "That ground is too rough for trees to establish on. You'll lose half of them in the first summer." "I'll lose about 12%, she said, based on establishment data from comparable sites in Tennessee and Virginia. Owen looked up. He had not expected the 12%. He had expected her to say she thought it would be fine, the way people say things will be fine when they don't know whether they will be. "Lenora, I want to be honest with you. I appreciate that, Owen. That back 40 has been rough ground for 20 years. I know that ground. Daryl knew that ground. We talked about that ground more than once, and we both agreed it was not worth the cost of improvement. Daryl and I talked about it too," she said. "He thought it wasn't worth the cost of improvement, because the only improvement he could picture was reseeding it for pasture, which would have cost $800 and produced $800 worth of forage in a good year. That's not what I'm doing." Owen looked at his hands again. "People are going to talk. They already are, if you heard about it at Clement's." He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "They're going to say you're spending money. Daryl worked 40 years to put in the ground on an experiment. Footing. Daryl worked 40 years to put this farm on sound footing. The farm is on sound footing. The back 40 has been waste ground for 11 years. I am not spending the farm's savings on this. I am spending $4,200 on bare root seedlings and establishment costs for 40 acres that are currently producing zero income and have produced zero income since 1983. The math is not difficult." Owen drove home that evening. He told his wife over supper that Lenora Fisk was going to lose another $20,000 on the back 40. Before she figured out it couldn't be saved. He said it because he needed to say it. He said it in the way people state their positions out loud when their positions have already begun to feel less certain than they did an hour ago. The second person who made it her business to weigh in was Glenda Pruitt, Owen's wife, who was also the secretary of the Boyle County Farm Bureau Women's Committee, and who organized the fall potluck at the First Baptist every year, and who was not a malicious woman, but who understood county opinion the way a conductor understands an orchestra, and who could move information through the social fabric of Boyle County faster than the weekly paper. Glenda did not come to see Lenora. She called 3 women she trusted, and within 2 weeks, those 3 women had told 6 more. And by October of 1994, the consensus in the social layer of Boyle County that organized potlucks and talked after church was that poor Lenora Fisk was spending her dead husband's money on trees that wouldn't amount to anything for 30 years, by which point Lenora would be 70, and wasn't it sad what grief did to a person's judgment? The third person was Reuben Aldcroft, the loan officer at Farmers National Bank in Danville, who held the operating note on the Fisk farm. Reuben was 54, the son of a tobacco farmer, a careful man who had worked his way up through the bank across 28 years, and who believed that agricultural lending was a relationship of mutual caution, which meant the farmer was cautious about borrowing, and the banker was cautious about what the farmer did with the money. The Fisk farm had an operating note of $18,000 for the 1994 crop year, borrowed in the spring against the tobacco allotment and the hay sales, paid down in November, at harvest. It had been borrowed and paid on this schedule for 11 consecutive years. Reuben had never had a problem with the Fisk account. He called Lenora in October and asked her to come in. She came. She brought the folder. Reuben did not open the folder. He looked at it on his desk, and he looked at Lenora, and he said, "Mrs. Fisk, the bank is aware that you're planning some changes to the back 40. I am planning a silvopasture planting, 480 trees, mixed walnut and oak. Sheep integration beginning in year 3, Mrs. Fisk. The bank's concern is the time horizon. Trees don't produce income for. The sheep will produce income in year 2. Net projected income from a 60-head rotational flock beginning in year 3 is between $4,000 and $6,000 annually. The timber value, which I am not projecting as income on any near-term basis, will be assessable by year 15 on the walnut and year 20 on the oak. The operating note will be paid in full in November, as it has been paid every November since 1983. The tree planting is being financed out of a separate savings account that has nothing to do with the operating line." Reuben looked at the folder. "May I ask how much is in that account?" "Enough to plant the trees and establish the flock and carry 3 years of operating costs, with the back 40 producing 0 income, which is what it is currently producing." Reuben leaned back in his chair. He was a fair man. He did not use his position to push people toward decisions that protected the bank at the expense of the borrower. But he had spent 28 years watching optimistic projections fail in the field, and he had a professional habit of applying what he called the grief discount to decisions made in the first year after a loss, which meant he assumed a widow in her first year of farm management alone was working with judgment that was 20% less reliable than it would be in the second year. He approved the operating note. He had already approved it before the meeting. He made a note in the file that the borrower had demonstrated unusual familiarity with the projected income trajectory of the proposed planting, and that funds from the operating line were allocated to the silvopasture establishment. He drove home that evening and told his wife the Fisk widow was either very well prepared or very lucky, and he was not yet sure which. The tree seedlings arrived in late February of 1995. 490 bare-root walnut and oak whips, 2 to 3 feet tall, bundled in wet burlap and loaded onto a flatbed from the state nursery in quicksand. Tess drove the flatbed. Lenora walked the rows she had staked out the previous fall. Following the survey lines, she had pulled herself with a hand level and 2 rolls of orange flagging tape across 3 November afternoons. She had done the staking alone. She had not hired a surveyor. She had read the manual from the state forestry office twice and done the geometry herself on the kitchen table with a protractor and a piece of graph paper. They planted for 4 days. It rained on the second day, which was the best thing that could have happened, and the red clay that Owen Pruitt had, called too rough for establishment, opened up and took the bare root stock the way decent ground takes water. Tess planted faster than Lenora and did not make her feel slow about it. At the end of the 4th day, 480 trees were in the ground, and 10 were held back in a bucket of wet sand as replacements for the ones that wouldn't establish, which Lenora calculated would be 57. It was 53. She lost 53 trees in the first summer. She replaced 41 of them in the fall. By the end of the second growing season, there were 468 living trees on the back 40, spaced in rows that her mowing tractor could navigate with 8 inches of clearance on either side. Owen Pruitt drove past the back A40 on the county road in July of 1995 and saw the rows and pulled over and looked for a long time. They were small. They were not impressive. They were sticks in a field of grass, which was exactly what they were supposed to be in year one. He drove home and did not say anything to his wife about it. The fourth person to involve himself was a man named Declan Burr, who served on the Boyle County Agricultural Extension Committee and who had been in that position for 14 years, and who believed, without malice and with complete sincerity, that his job was to direct county farmers toward practices that had been demonstrated to work in Boyle County and away from practices that had not. Silvopasture had not been demonstrated to work in Boyle County. Declan Burr had never read the extension bulletin from the University of Kentucky that Lenora had ordered. He had not read it because it had been published 2 years before and had not yet been adopted into the standard committee recommendation materials, which were updated every 5 years. He had not read it because nobody in Boyle County had asked him about it. The first time anyone in Boyle County asked him about it, he drove out to the Fisk farm in April of 1996. Lenora was in the back 40 when he arrived, walking the rows and checking the winter survival of the second-year trees. She came to the fence when she saw his truck. "Mrs. Fisk," Declan said, "I've gotten some questions from farmers in the county about what you're doing out here. I'm happy to talk about it." He looked at the rows. Year 2, the trees were 3 to 4 feet tall, and the fescue between the rows was already greening up from the winter. It looked, he had to admit, more organized than he had expected. "I want to make sure you're aware that the Extension Service hasn't formally endorsed this kind of integrated system for conditions in this part of Kentucky." "I'm aware," she said. "I'm not running the Extension Service's operation. I'm running mine." Declan was a decent man, and he heard something in her voice that he recognized as the sound of someone who had done more work on a question than he had, which was an July, uncomfortable sound to hear from someone you had come to advise. "Have you been in contact with the university about this?" "I have 3 years of correspondence with their forestry division and with a researcher named Alton Webb at the Savannah Institute. I have site visit notes from farms in Virginia, Tennessee, and Ontario. I have establishment data specific to red clay sites in the Upper South." She paused. "Would you like to see the folder?" Declan Burr drove back to his office. He called the University of Kentucky Forestry Division that afternoon. He asked for Alton Webb, who had by then moved to a position at Purdue. And he was a dry guy, and he reached a colleague of Webb's who spent 20 minutes explaining the research basis for silvopasture integration on marginal agricultural ground in the transition zone between the Upper South and the Midwest. Declan listened. He asked 6 questions. He thanked the colleague and hung up and sat in his office for a while. He did not call Lenora back. He did not go out again. He did not endorse her project to the committee, but he also did not raise objections at the next meeting when her name came up. He simply passed and made a note to himself to read the extension bulletin when it appeared in the updated recommendation materials, which it did in 1998. The 5th person was Owen Pruitt's younger brother, a man named Noel Pruitt, who farmed 180 acres in the southern part of the county, and who was louder than Owen, and who mentioned Lenora Fisk's back 40 at the fall crop meeting in October of 1996 in a way that was meant to be funny. He said something about planting retirement funds, and laughed, and 2 other men laughed with him, and Reuben Aldcroft from the bank was in the room and did not laugh, and Owen Pruitt was in the room and looked at the floor. Lenora heard about it 3 days later, from Tess, who had heard it from a woman at the feed store. Lenora listened to the story and nodded and did not say anything about it that evening. The following morning, she went out to the back 40 and walked the rows for an hour in the October cold, and by the end of that hour she had made 2 decisions. The first was that she was going to apply for a cost-share grant from the Kentucky Division of Forestry for a riparian buffer, planting along the creek line on the eastern edge of the property, which she had been planning to do in the spring, but which she now wanted the paperwork filed before November. The second was that she was not going to spend another hour of her life thinking about Noel Pruitt. She filed the paperwork on November 8th. The grant was approved in February of 1997. The riparian buffer went in that spring, another 220 trees along 800 linear feet of creek, planted with cost-share funding that covered 60% of the establishment cost. She did not tell anyone she had applied. The first anyone knew about it was when the trees went in and someone on the county road slowed down to look. The sheep arrived in April of 1997, 64 Katahdin ewes purchased from a flock dispersal sale in Garrard County for $88 a head. Katahdins were hair sheep, which meant they shed their winter coat and did not need shearing, which Lenora had chosen deliberately because she did not want to add shearer scheduling to the list of things she was managing alone. She had spent the previous winter reading 3 books on rotational grazing, 1 USDA bulletin on sheep integration in agroforestry systems, and a set of notes she had taken at a practical farmers conference in Ames, Iowa, where she had driven 400 miles in February to attend a 1-day session on silvopasture livestock integration and had been one of 4 women in a room of 31. Tess had not gone to Ames. Tess had stayed home to watch the farm and had met a man named Daniel Creel at the Danville Winter Livestock Auction in January, and was by February spending her weekends at his family's farm in Lincoln County. Lenora watched this from the appropriate distance and said nothing except the things that needed to be said. She drove to Ames alone. The first lambs hit the ground in late March of 1997, before the ewes went out to the tree alleys. Lenora had the small barn at the back of the property fitted with lambing panels she had bought secondhand from a farm closing sale in November. 61 ewes lambed. She lost 4 lambs in the first 3 days, which was within the range she had read to expect. She was up at 2 and 5 and 7 for the first 2 weeks, and then the barn settled into the kind of rhythm a lambing barn settles into when the worst of the early weather has passed, and the ewes know what they are doing. By the end of May, the ewe and lamb pairs were rotating through the tree alleys on a 7-day paddock schedule. The trees were in their 3rd leaf, 5 to 7 feet tall, branched enough to provide modest afternoon shade. The sheep moved through the paddocks without disturbing the tree roots, which were already past the depth any sheep hoof would reach. The fescue between the rows, which had been establishing for 2 years without grazing, was dense and productive, and the sheep put on weight at a rate that Lenora tracked weekly in the brown notebook she now kept in the pocket of her barn coat, instead of the glove box of the truck. The first year's lamb crop sold at the Garrard County stockyards in October of 1997 for $4,840. The expenses for the sheep enterprise that first year, including the cost of the ewes, the lambing supplies, the fencing materials for the paddock system, and the hay and minerals to carry the flock through the winter, came to $9,200. The net was negative. She had expected this. The folder in her kitchen drawer had a typed projection showing negative net returns in years 1 and 2 of the sheep enterprise and positive returns from year 3 forward. She had written the projection herself. She had checked it twice. The men at the fall crop meeting in October of 1997 did not talk about her trees anymore. They talked about the sheep, which were a funnier subject, because nobody in Boyle County ran sheep in tree alleys. And the idea of running sheep in tree alleys sounded, to the kind of mind that had decided walnut trees would never work in red clay, like the kind of additional mistake a person makes when they are doubling down on an original mistake. Noel Pruitt said something at the meeting that fall that was funnier than what he had said the year before, and that got a better laugh. And Reuben Aldcroft was not at that meeting. And Owen Pruitt was, and looked at the floor again. In the winter of 1998, Tess told Lenora she was going to marry Daniel Creel and move to Lincoln County. She said it at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in January, with the particular combination of certainty and apology that accompanies news you have known for 6 months but have been waiting to say. Lenora looked at her daughter across the table. Tess was 26. She had come home from Lexington 4 years before to help run a farm, and had stayed longer than she needed to, and had given more than she had been asked to give. "Is he good to you?" Lenora asked. "He is. Then marry him." Tess looked at her. "The farm. The farm is mine. The farm will be here. You live your life." They sat at the table for a while. The house was quiet in the way a Kentucky farmhouse is quiet in January, when the livestock are settled and the fields are sleeping and the only sound is the furnace cycling on and off. Lenora looked at the folder in the kitchen drawer, which she could not see but knew was there. She looked at the kitchen table where she had done the projections and checked the geometry and read the letters from the researcher in Madison and planned every step of a 10-year system that she was now going to run alone. She had always known she was going to run it alone. She had not known until that January afternoon that knowing it and having it arrive were two different things. Tess got married in April of 1998. Lenora sat in the front pew and held her hands in her lap and was dry-eyed through the ceremony and cried in the truck on the way home, alone, which was the right way to cry. The summer of 1998 was the kind of summer that proves arguments. It was hot. It was hot in the way central Kentucky gets hot in late July, when the humidity sits on the ground and does not move, and the temperature stays above 95 degrees for 12 straight days. In the open tobacco fields which Owen Pruitt and his neighbors had planted in the standard rotation, the heat stress on the plants was severe enough that the leaf quality dropped, and the cured weight came in 14% below projection. In the cornfields, the tassel period coincided with the worst of the heat, and pollination was incomplete on a significant percentage of the stands. And the county corn average came in at 112 bushels against a projected 138. In the back 40, the temperature in the tree alleys on the hottest days ran 8 to 11 degrees cooler than the ambient temperature in the open fields, because the walnut and oak canopy, now in its 4th full leaf, was doing what tree canopy does, which is intercept solar radiation and transpire moisture and create a microclimate in the air column beneath it. The sheep grazed in the cooler alleys through the heat of the day and moved to the open paddock edge at dawn and dusk when the temperature was manageable, and they did not go off feed during the heat wave the way the beef cattle in Owen Pruitt's pastures went off feed, and they did not lose body condition during the 12 hot days the way cattle lose body condition when they are standing in the sun with nowhere to go. The lamb weights that October were the best she had recorded. The sale brought $7,200. The sheep enterprise net for 1998 was $1,800 positive, 2 years ahead of the projection in the folder. Owen Pruett's beef cattle herd that fall averaged 84 pounds below normal sale weight because of the summer heat stress and the feed conversion loss. The difference in Owen Pruett's cattle check from a normal year was roughly $11,000 on his 140-head herd. Owen did not call Lenora that fall. He did not say anything at the fall crop meeting. He went home after the meeting and sat in his kitchen and thought about the 8 degrees cooler for 12 days and did not like what he was thinking and did not stop thinking it. In the spring of 1999, Owen came to see Lenora. He came on a Tuesday afternoon in April, unannounced. The way people come when they have been working up to something for several months and have decided that calling ahead gives the other person too much time to prepare an answer to a question you haven't asked yet. She was in the barn when he pulled in. She came out in her barn coat with straw on her boots. They stood in the yard. "Lenora," he said. "Owen." He looked at the back 40, which was not visible from the yard, but which both of them knew was back there. He had driven past it on the county road earlier that week, and the trees were beginning to bud, the 5th spring, and from the road they did not look like sticks anymore. They looked like trees. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that I understand if the answer is no." She waited. "I've been watching that back 40 for 5 years. He stopped. He was a man who did not find words easily when the words required him to be wrong about something. "I've got 60 acres of rough ground on the north end of my property. Red clay, same soil series as yours, maybe a little steeper. I've been running it as hay ground, but the yield has been going down for 6 years, and I'm cutting it at a loss if I account for fuel and equipment time." "I know that ground," Lenora said. "I want to know how you did it. Not the general idea, the specific plan. What you planted and what you paid and what you did wrong and what you'd do different." He looked at her. "I'll pay you for your time. I know what a consulting hour costs." Lenora looked at the barn, then at the back 40 direction, then at Owen. "I don't want your money, Owen." He nodded slowly. He had expected this. He was not sure what he had expected after it. "Come back Saturday morning," she said. "Bring a notebook." Owen Pruett came back Saturday with a legal pad. He stayed 4 hours. He walked the tree alleys and the sheep paddocks and the riparian buffer along the creek, and he asked 31 questions, which Lenora knew because she counted them. He did not say anything about 1994, about the kitchen visit, about the 40 years of Daryl's work, about waste ground. He asked his 31 questions, and he wrote the answers in the legal pad. And at the end of the 4 hours, he stood at the fence line where the back 40 met the county road and looked back at the whole system. "What made you sure enough to start?" he asked. It was the 32nd question. "I wasn't sure," she said. "I was informed. That's different." Owen Pruett went home. He did not plant trees that year. He planted trees in the spring of 2000, 60 acres of mixed walnut and white oak with a fescue clover undersow. With the spacing specifications he had written in the legal pad on the Saturday he spent at the Fisk farm. He ordered bare root stock from the same state nursery in Quicksand. He called Lenora 3 times during the planting with questions. She answered without making him feel the calls were anything other than normal. He did not tell Noel about the planting until the trees were in the ground, and when he told him without apology, which was a thing Owen Pruett had not found easy to do in his life, and which he found, in this case, surprisingly simple. In the summer of 2001, A writer named Penelope Bauer from the Kentucky Agricultural Reporter drove out to the Fisk farm. She was 27, out of journalism school at UK 2 years before. And she had been assigned to write a story about alternative farming practices in central Kentucky and had been given Lenora's name by the county extension office, specifically by Declan Burr, who by 2001 had read every piece of research published on silvopasture in the transition zone, and who had stopped not mentioning Lenora's project and had started mentioning it to anyone who asked about forage management on marginal ground. Bob. Penelope arrived expecting eccentricity and left with 7 pages of handwritten notes and a photograph of Lenora Fisk standing in the 7th-year tree alleys with the canopy closing overhead and the sheep visible in the middle distance, moving through the paddock beyond. The story ran in September of 2001. The headline was, "Boyle County Farmers' Integrated Woodland System Outperforms Conventional Pasture Through 3 Drought Years." It was a straight agricultural piece without drama or profile, the kind of story, the kind of the Kentucky Agricultural Reporter published every issue, and it would have been read by its usual audience of 200 subscribers and then been forgotten, except that the University of Kentucky's College of Agriculture put it on their research news page, where a freelance writer for a national farming magazine saw it and called Lenora in November. The magazine piece ran in February of 2002. It was read in 40 states. Lenora received 69 letters and 42 emails. The emails through the county extension office address because she did not yet have her own. She answered everyone on her own, the letters on the typewriter, the emails at the library computer in Danville on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Tess called the morning the magazine hit the newsstands. She had seen it at the farm store in Lincoln County. "Mama," she said. "I know," Lenora said. "There's a picture of you on page 43. I know. You look like you own the place." "I do own the place," Lenora said. There was a pause on the line. "I should have stayed," Tess said. "You should have married Daniel," Lenora said. "Which you did, which was the right thing." The summer of 2002 was another dry summer, not as severe as 1998, but dry enough through June and July to stress the open pastures in the county. The Fisk Back 40 produced forage through the dry period at a rate that Lenora measured on a weekly basis with a forage plate meter, the kind of tool that nobody in Boyle County was using in 2002. And the numbers she wrote in the current brown notebook showed that the tree-shaded alleys maintained 63% of their normal forage production through the period, while the open pastures in the county were at 31% of normal. The sheep did not lose condition. These that fall were the best she had recorded. The sale brought $9,400. The total net income from the back 40 in 2002, including a timber stand improvement payment from a federal cost share program she had enrolled in the previous year, was $14,200 from 40 acres that had produced zero income in 1993. She did not advertise the figure. She wrote it in the notebook and she went to bed. Owen Pruitt's trees, in their 3rd year on his north 60 acres, were doing what 3rd-year trees do on red, clay soil in Kentucky, with a good fescue clover undersow, which is to say they were alive and growing and unimpressive and entirely on schedule with what the research said they would be doing in year 3. He had not yet run sheep in the alleys. He was planning to start in 2003. He drove past the Fisk farm more often than he used to. In the fall of 2003, Tess's husband Daniel had a farming accident in Lincoln County that broke 3 ribs and his right wrist and put him in the hospital for a week and in a sling for 8 weeks after. He recovered fully. But while he was recovering, Tess came home to help Lenora with the fall lamb sale and the hay storage and the winter preparation. And for the first time in 5 years, she walked the tree alleys on a November morning, with the canopy above her shedding its leaves in the cold, clear air. "It's different than I expected," Tess said. "What did you expect?" "Darker, more like a woods." She looked up at the canopy, which was open enough to see the sky through in gaps, and at the fescue between the rows, which was still green in November when the open pastures had gone brown. "This looks like it's supposed to be here." "That's what a farm looks like when it's working the way the land wants to work," Lenora said. "The land doesn't want to be one thing." They walked to the end of the row. The creek line buffer along the east edge was 8 years old now, the tallest trees 30 feet, the bank stable in a way it had not been stable since Lenora could remember. "I've been thinking," Tess said. Lenora waited. "Daniel is going to be farming another 30 years at least. His ground in Lincoln County is good ground, conventional row crop. He's not going to change what he's doing. I wouldn't expect him to. But I want to learn this." She looked along the alley. "Not eventually. Now, you have a farm in Lincoln County. Daniel has a farm in Lincoln County," Tess said. "I have a farm in Boyle County. This farm. I just haven't been running it." Lenora looked at her daughter. Tess was 31. She had her father's hands and her mother's way of standing at a fence line, looking at ground the way you look at something you already know the answer to and are letting yourself know it. "The sheep herd needs to go to 90 ewes if the paddock system is going to work at full efficiency in the expanded alleys," Lenora said. "I've been putting off the expansion because I didn't want to manage it alone." 90 ewes, Tess said. "And the north alleys haven't been folded into the rotation yet. I need someone who can manage the paddock moves independently so I can focus on the timber stand assessment." Tess looked at the north alleys. She looked at her mother. "I'll be here by March," she said. She was. She moved into the farmhouse in the first week of March 2004, and her husband drove over from Lincoln County on weekends. And the 468 trees in the back 40 had a second person who knew their names, or something close to their names, and who walked the rows in the morning with a notebook in her pocket. In 2006, the Kentucky Division of Forestry asked Lenora Fisk to present at their annual Woodland Stewardship Conference in Lexington. She was 53 years old. She had not spoken publicly since the Penelope Bauer interview in 2001, which had not been public but had felt that way. She almost said no. Tess made a case for it over dinner one evening, quietly and without pressure, the way Tess made most of her cases, and in the end, Lenora agreed. She stood at the podium in a meeting room at the Lexington Convention Center with 64 people in the audience, most of them foresters and extension agents, and a scattered group of farmers who had driven long distances and were sitting in the back rows with the posture of people who have driven long distances. She had a single index card with 4 numbers on it. She put the card on the podium, looked at it once, and spoke without it. "In 1994, I planted trees on 40 acres of ground that my husband had called the rough ground for the 11 years he worked it before he died," she said. "The county called it waste ground. The bank called it a complication. My neighbor told me the clay was too rough for establishment and that I would lose half the trees in the first summer." She paused. "I lost 11.5%, within the range the research predicted." The room was quiet. "What I want to tell you is not what I planted and how I spaced it. That information is in the University of Kentucky Silvo Pasture Guide that most of you have already read. What I want to tell you is what the land told me after 12 years of listening to it. She looked at the card on the podium. She did not pick it up. In 1998, the summer temperature in my tree alleys ran 9 degrees cooler than the ambient temperature in the open pastures during a 12-day heat event. My lambs did not go off feed. My neighbor's cattle lost 84 pounds per head average across the summer. That is not a temperature statistic. That is a profit statement. Someone in the third row wrote something on a notepad. In 2002, my 40 acres produced $14,200 in net income. The county average for comparable open pasture ground was $1,140 per 40 acres. I am not telling you I was smarter than my neighbors. I am telling you that I had a folder in my kitchen drawer that they had not read and would not have believed if I had shown it to them. The folder was available to anyone. The University of Kentucky published most of it. The Savannah Institute published the rest. The knowledge was not hidden. It was simply not convenient to believe. She paused again. The land in this part of Kentucky does not want to be grass alone. It is a transition zone between the hardwood uplands and the bluegrass plain. It has been growing trees and grass and animals together for longer than it has been growing anything alone. When you plant trees back into the grass, you are not doing something new. You are doing something very old. The reason it works is not because of the research. The reason it works is because the land already knew how. She picked up the index card and folded it and put it in her pocket. The room stayed quiet for a moment, and then it was not quiet. Reuben Aldcroft was not in the audience. Owen Pruitt was. He had driven from Danville that morning in his truck, alone, without telling anyone at the fall crop meeting that he was going. He was 61 years old, and his north 60 acres were in their 7th year, and the trees were beginning to close canopy in the alleys, and his sheep flock, started in 2003, had cleared $6,200 the previous fall. He found Lenora in the lobby after the presentation. "Lenora," he said. "Owen." He looked at his hands, which was the old habit. Then he looked up. "I drove from Danville this morning to hear you say something I should have known in 1994. You came and asked Saturday in 1999, she said. You planted in 2000. You're 7 years in. That's not a long detour. I cost myself 6 years of growth. You cost yourself 6 years. The ground didn't lose anything. The ground was waiting." Owen looked out the lobby window at the Lexington Street traffic. He was a man who had grown corn and beans and tobacco and cattle for 40 years, and had never planted a tree on purpose in his life before 2000. And now he had 60 acres of 7-year walnut and oak that were going to produce more income per acre in his retirement than any field he had worked in his active years. And he had only done it because a woman across the county road had done it first, and he had been wrong about her and had needed 6 years to say so. "What do you see?" he asked. "When you walk the back 40 now." She thought about it. It was the question she had been asked most often since the magazine piece in 2002, and she had never answered it the same way twice. "I see what it was before we simplified it," she said. "I see ground that is doing 4 things at once: growing timber, growing forage, cooling the air, holding the creek bank. We spent 50 years asking it to do one thing and calling it waste ground when it couldn't do one thing well enough. It was never waste ground. It was ground we didn't know how to use." Owen nodded. He did not stay long. He shook hands with Tess, who had driven to Lexington with her mother, and was standing near the lobby door. And he drove back to Danville. He died in 2011, before his walnut timber came to harvest weight. His son took over the North 60. and continued the rotational flock, and in 2024 made the first timber harvest from the 23-year-old stand, which produced more per acre in one cutting than the ground had earned in the previous 12 years of hay production combined. But a dry July's knew do this because Owen, in the last few years of his life, had written it down carefully in a leather notebook he kept on the desk in the farm office, the way a man writes down the things he wants his children to know he learned. Lenora Fisk is 71 years old. Tess manages the daily operation now, the sheep rotation, and the timber stand assessments, and the cover crop mixes in the hay ground, and Lenora walks the alleys in the morning when the weather is decent, which is most mornings, because she is a person who has spent 30 years understanding that the most important work on a farm is the work of noticing. The back 40 is not the back 40 anymore. But it was a dry July. It is 210 acres of silvopasture in 3 separate blocks, expanded gradually across 12 years as the original system proved out, and the research base grew, and the neighbors who had laughed in 1994 came one by one to the county road and slowed down and looked. The 480 trees Lenora planted in the red clay in March of 1995, 480 bare-root walnut and oak whips, 2 to 3 feet tall, wrapped in wet burlap from the state nursery in quicksand, produced their first significant timber income in 2015. The walnut timber alone from the original planting sold for more than she had paid for the farm in 1985. $4,200 in seedlings and establishment, 12% establishment loss, within the predicted range. 40 acres that the county called waste ground in 1994. She had a folder in her kitchen drawer. She had 3 brown notebooks in the glove box of her truck. She had read every paper the university published and driven to Virginia and Tennessee and Ontario and Ames, Iowa, in February to sit in a room of 31 people and ask the questions she needed to ask. And then she had come home to Boyle County, Kentucky, and planted trees in red clay that everyone around her had agreed could not hold a tree. And she had been right, and they had been wrong, and the only difference between her and them was that she had done the reading. The ground already knew. She just asked it the right question.